and Grandpa was born in Iowa, I think. And I remember driving all the way to Iowa with Grandpa and my mom, and we went to like his high school reunion. I don't think there was like 12 people there or something because he was older for his grade, but I remember that being kind of cool, seeing where he grew up in Iowa in the middle of nowhere. But it was cool he got excited about it, so.
He grew up in Iowa, New Hampton, Iowa, small town. They had apparently a pretty nice middle-class life in New Hampton.
His parents were very diverse. His dad came from the wrong side of the tracks, and his mom's side of the family pretty much owned the town. My great-grandfather, W.G. Shaffer, owned one of the major banks in the town that they grew up in. And my grandfather, Phillips, was kind of a jack of all trades, but he was good with numbers, and he became a teller in that bank. And he married the daughter of the owner, which was fairly scandalous at the time. So.
His parents, he was the youngest of 4. His parents had 2 daughters that were 2 years apart, and then there was 10 years, and then they had 2 more kids 2 years apart. So he was the youngest. He was the only boy.
His sister's children were almost as close as his sisters were to him in age, so he spent a lot more time with his cousins growing up than he did with his older sisters. They were out of the house. You know, that was back when, 19 years old and you were out of the house. He had almost an aunt relationship with his older sisters. So it was really just him and his sister Ruth were the in-the-house kids.
He would tell stories about doing pranks at the high school. And every time he would tell a story, I would picture Jimmy Stewart, who was an old movie star back then, in my mind, because Grandpa, when he was young, he was tall and lanky, like Jimmy Stewart was. And I would just picture him doing things. His dad's dad was what we would call today a pharmacist. He was a druggist. And back then they didn't have regulations and stuff. And back then, like cocaine was legal and all these weird things, right? So my dad's grandfather was a druggist, and it turned out apparently he was addicted to some of the drugs that he used, became an alcoholic, and had a really kind of a tragic story. And so because of that, his son, who was my dad's father, never drank alcohol, like not even a drop, never. But when I was little, when my folks lived in California, they were working on their house, and Dad's parents came out to visit, and they were old by that time. So when they came out to visit, his old dad was so proud to get up and work on the house with my dad. And after that long day of work, Dad said that afterwards, Dad said, "Would you like a beer?" Cleve took a beer and took a sip and got sick. So I think it was like he just psyched himself out so much that the thought of drinking alcohol freaked him out. And my dad drank alcohol. He had no problem with that. He would drink beer.
His schooling was, he went to a year of Iowa State, then World War II came along. When he was in school at Iowa State, he had been in the Civilian Air Corps, which was, basically they knew we were going to get into the war eventually, so they started gearing up those kinds of programs. And a lot of, officer training stuff was going on in the late 30s because, early 40s, because they knew, eventually they were going to get into the war. It was either we were going to go over there or it was going to come to us. So he joined the Civilian Air Corps and was a pilot. And when World War II came out, he went into the pilot program, and then he came back and finished school after he got out of the Army. Or actually, Army Air Corps was what it was called back then, not the Air Force.
Bob was already a pilot when World War II happened, and they needed trainers for the pilots at that time. And that's what he did. He came to Stockton, did all his training there, and so he was very familiar with that area.
So His job in the Army, they considered him such a good pilot, so when he went to flight school and stuff, and they saw his aptitude, they said that they wanted him in the flight instructor school. So he taught flight instruction in Stockton Field in California. That was what he did for his duration, was taught other pilots how to be pilots.
Dad was going to Iowa State Teachers College, which is now Iowa State University. But at the time, he was working his way through school, so he got jobs. So when he enlisted, they found out that he had taught driver's ed and that he, had started learning to fly. So they pointed him in the area to be a flight instructor. So he taught kids how to fly airplanes. But he taught kids to fly, I think, small, the nimble little fighter planes.
The interesting one that I knew about was he used to say that, everyone thought that being a flight instructor meant that, you were safe back at home and, you didn't have to worry about being in combat and all that stuff, and you were pretty safe, and, you went home to a meal every night and all that stuff. But he said that 3 different times he almost died while he was there. One time he was in a plane with a student that locked up and the plane was aiming towards the ground, and he finally got the plane under control, and the guy left the yoke of the plane when they were underneath telephone poles by the time he got control of the plane. And he said another time the plane next to his plane, the guy that was refueling the plane was smoking a cigarette, because everyone back then smoked cigarettes, and he lit the refueling truck on fire and it burst into a ball of fire. And he said that if it had been on the other side of his plane, that was the door to get out, and he would have probably had a big problem getting out of the airplane. And then the 3rd time was he was on the flight line doing his pre-flight checks in an airplane, and another plane with an instructor and a student in it crashed into the plane directly across from him on the flight line. So it wasn't as safe and as easy a job as everyone made. All the other guys came through and said, "Oh, flight instructor, you got it so easy." And he's like, "Well, easy is a relative term."
And he was stationed at a couple of different air bases during the war. I think once in Texas and one in California. And he told some stories about those days. One that stuck with him, and I could tell that it stuck with him because when he told the story, he was lost in memory about it. And it's not a nice story, but he remembered one time they were at the air base and a young learning, pilot in training crashed his plane, and the plane caught on fire. And he was one of the first people over there after they put out the fire, and they tried to pull the body out, and the guy's hands were still on the steering wheel, and Dad said that his hands stayed stuck to the steering wheel because he'd been burned, and like you could tell he was still seeing, and that impacted him. That was, yeah. Ugh. And he also told a story about how his best friend in high school, who he grew up with, right, this kid, his name was James Woodruff, and he was Woody. And Woody and Shafe were, the pranksters and whatever. Jim Woodruff, when he enlisted, he was sent into combat. He was a pilot sent into combat, and he didn't make it. I don't know if he was shot down or what, but he didn't make it, and that one really impacted Dad too. He would talk about that a lot. He would tell stories about Woody, and gosh, I'm sorry. So that got him.
And he kind of didn't like to tell people that, like, the year after the war, before he went back to school, he got on an Indian motorcycle with like $4 in his pocket, and he took off to Montana and drove through like the mountains of western United States and was driving all around and just riding a motorcycle around until he got in a motorcycle wreck. A woman pulled out in front of him and almost killed him.
And then after the war was over, he purchased from the Army motorcycle. So they didn't need them anymore. They had a ton of surplus of them. And apparently these motorcycles, I think they were Indian motorcycles, they'd been built specifically for the Army, and they were going to be used in the African theater. But they were really, really heavy bikes, and they wouldn't go in the sand. They would bury themselves in the sand, so they didn't work. So the Army couldn't use them or whatever. I'm sure that was, government waste or whatever. But so he purchased this heavy Indian motorcycle and drove it all over the place. So it's kind of funny, I know my dad from being this old guy, but when he was young, he was a daredevil. He got in a few serious accidents from that motorcycle, and after I don't know how many he was in, 2 or 3, but the last one where he had to have back surgery and it really caused problems, then he was anti-motorcycle after that. He would not let us ride motorcycles, or not like I was going to ride a motorcycle, but ride on the back of a motorcycle, no.
Okay, so originally Bob came from Kansas, well actually Iowa, and then after the war he went to Kansas and lived in Topeka for a while with his first wife. And then they divorced and he lived with my mom in Chicago. He met Grandma because he was, at the time, an insurance salesman who was selling group life insurance policies to big companies. And he went around the country to all these big corporations and talked to their, whoever was giving out the benefits, basically what an HR kind of person does now. And he would talk them into buying health insurance for all the employees. And Grandma was a secretary at one of the businesses that he visited, and that's how they met. And the rest is 3 kids and a house and a dog and a history.
We had a wonderful wedding. When Bob was working in Stockton, he stayed at a hotel and became good friends with the owner, and we went out with them at times, and then Bob proposed, and we had to have the wedding. We had to have the reception at the hotel where he stayed, which was fine. We were married at the chapel at the college where I was a student at the time.
Terribly hard for love to ever last.
And then he got a job offer in California when I was about 2 years old. And we lived in Northern California in Marin County, north of San Francisco, in between San Francisco and Napa Valley. And they told Sharon that she couldn't have any more kids, so they adopted a baby in '66. And 2 years later, as they say, once the pressure's off, suddenly she got pregnant again and Courtney was born in '68.
Robert Scott Phillips was born in Chicago. And we were there for about 4 years, and then we moved back to California. And Bob took a position at West Coast Life Insurance Company, and we were there for about 4 or 5 years. He got a position down in Southern California, and we moved to the Los Angeles area. We lived in Palos Verdes, which was on the other side of the ocean.
Growing up with Bob was kind of interesting because we were a 60s family, but he had a very 50s mentality to everything. He was very much, the father went to work and the mother stayed home with the kids. We didn't see him all that much just because he was under that mindset that, you worked an 8-hour day, and in California he had a 2-hour commute into San Francisco and a 2-hour commute home. So we never saw him in the morning, and we didn't see him in the evening until it was dark. So he was more of a weekend father.
I know he collected a lot of things because he grew up in the Great Depression, so he always kept screws. Most people throw that away, but he had a whole thing of them. So
he grew up in a totally different world because he grew up during the Depression, and that made him a very frugal person. So he grew up, for an example, when we were in California, the Navy base closed down. He went out in our station wagon and salvaged all the wood flooring from the barracks in the Navy buildings. And he pulled out all the nails, and I spent 2 weeks pounding nails straight again so he could reuse nails. He had cans and coffee cans full of nails that he salvaged out of this building that we kept and he used because he didn't want to buy new nails, because those were perfectly good nails once you straightened them out. So he was the original reuse, recycle generation. I don't know exactly. I'm sure, you know, he was raised as a Baptist in Iowa, and I'm sure that the family had a real strong religious background, but he liked the ceremony, he liked the brotherhood, he liked all that. But, you know, as a child, I don't remember many discussions on the theology part of it. You know, this is, you know, how God is, this is what God, we never had a discussion like that. He never talked theology with me. We never discussed, I don't think I ever actually knew what his higher power thoughts were about, you know, what God is, who Jesus was, those kinds of things. And he kind of let all three of us make our own decisions on, you know, I have 2 Catholic sisters now. So he really didn't push any religious connotations on any of us. So, but he did like the brotherhood and all the, you know, all the things that the church gave him. And I think it gave him a lot of comfort in doing that, because it was something that he'd always had on Sundays. You just went together and got together with all the people. He was kind of a math savant, and he always liked to, you know, to use his math skills whenever possible. So the church needed someone to count the money and be above board and all of that. So he was always that person in the church. So deacon in the church. You know, when they passed the trays around, he was always the one that the trays always came to at the end. And you'd see your dad with this big, huge pile of cash as he was walking out the church. So it was kind of an interesting thing for us. And you know, that was one of the first things he always did, was when we moved to a new town or a new place, you know, he always found the church that, and it was kind of funny too, because, you know, at one time we went to the Presbyterian church, and then the next time we were at the Christian church, and then the Congregationalists, and I don't think he had a specific flavor that he agreed with. You know, as long as there was a cross up on the wall and Jesus was hanging from it, he pretty much was okay with that. So, and you know, the funny thing was, as a child, we came from a very eclectic neighborhood, right? So, you know, one family was Italian Catholic, and the Wongs were Buddhists, and the, you know, Jewish, and the Browns were this Southern Baptists, and Greek Orthodox and the Babbages, and all these different groups. It was kind of interesting that we would go to each other's churches, and you'd get this total, overwhelming, holy crow. You ain't singing the same songs, you aren't saying the same words, you aren't doing the same stuff. And I think it made us all kind of more open to each other's religions. And I think that was one of the things that our families did that was pretty amazing, is gave us the opportunity to see outside our little shell of a world really, really early. I mean, I remember going to Eric Wong's Buddhist temple at maybe 7 years old. So I think one of the nice things about being raised in California in the 60s was that my parents were much more open to new ideas.
Mom and Dad always had projects, right? They always did something. They would buy a house that needed work and fix it up, and then sell it for more money, and buy another house that needed work and fix it up for more money. But Dad always had a beer. He would drink, in California, I think, he would drink Ham's beer, and I remember the commercials for it. It was a cartoon bear. Or he would drink Olympia beer. And in the 70s, like when they first started having light beers, back then when it was a new thing, he drank Ole Gold. That was the light beer from Olympia. Ole Gold, that was my dad, Ole Gold. I can remember when my sister and I were little, he would let us sit on his lap, and he would let us take a sip of beer. And I remember it was it tasted horrible, right? It tastes horrible, but it was such a special thing. Like, I knew that was special, that I got to have a sip of Dad's beer. I was proud of that. I was like, this is big.
When we were in Southern California, he was very active in the school with our son and daughter. He built all the booths for the fair that we had, and he was very active with our son in Cub Scouts, other activities. They were busy all the time because my son was into everything, and he drug his dad along usually. So.
Okay, so in California, and this is probably one of my favorite childhood memories, is we lived in California, and we kind of lived, Marin County kind of went like this, and the ocean side was here and the bay side was here, and it kind of came up, and we lived kind of on this hillish part of it, right? And so we would get up on the hill, and he would make box kites, and he would make string holders, and we would send box kites, and he'd get sometimes 3 miles of fishing line, and we would send box kites out over the San Francisco Bay. And on a nice breezy day, you'd see the fishing line just go out, and then you'd see this tiny little dot of a box kite, and it would take an hour to reel these box kites back in. It would take an hour to reel it out, and then you'd set it in the ground, and this box kite would just be out, and you could barely see the thing, and it would just be out over, with this 2 miles of fishing line out over the bay, and you just watch this box kite just fly back and forth for like hundreds of yards back and forth because of the slack in the string. And we'd spend the afternoon just watching this box kite fly back and forth, have a little picnic, head up on the hill, and then he'd reel these things in, and we probably did it every, that was his big thing, was as soon as the winds got up to about 20 miles an hour steady, time to go kite flying. It was, that was one of the big things, I think, from his childhood. And he made the box kites, with string, newspaper, sticks, put it all together, tied it all tight, got it all squared up, put a little kite tail on it, put the strings. You had to have the strings come off of it just the right way so the box kite held at just the right angle. It was kind of amazing. We'd lose about 1 every 3 kites. And when the string would break, the kite would just go. It was just gone. And I'm sure this kite string was dangling through neighborhoods and stuff, going all the way through town.
In Northern California, we had the house that was next to a dead end. And so every 4th of July, we had a big 4th of July party out there where we had coolers of pops, and it was the Shasta pop. And food, and the whole neighborhood would come out and shoot off fireworks. We'd go up on the hill behind the house and do fireworks up there. We had a fire in the back of the hill. We had a huge hill we backed up to in California, and it caught on fire. And you had to water down your roof so it didn't catch on fire. Every house that I have lived in with Dad, he didn't love to, but he always had projects. The first house, they put a 2nd floor on. The house on the other side of the dead end, they pushed a wall out, I believe it was 6 feet. The one in Dodge finished the basement, then built a whole new house and finished that basement. So always projects going on.
We had a pool in our backyard, and it was always, as a small child, everybody in California was on the swim team, right? That was, you didn't play football, you didn't play baseball, you were on the swim team. Everyone in our neighborhood was on the swim team. So the swim team was the big thing. And I was on the swim team, and as I got better and better and raced more and more, the who gave who the lead changed to the point where now he only had to swim down the pool and I had to swim down and back in the same time. And I was like maybe 12 or 13. And that was the the evolution of who gave who the head start was a kind of an interesting thing, and finally he just stopped racing me altogether.
When I was little, they were in California. When we lived in Southern California, I looked this up on Google Maps and found that the house we lived in, was like a half a mile from the ocean, right? And in this like really fancy place. So they had money at that point. Well, he was working for a man who, because I asked him this afterwards, he was working for a man who wanted him to cheat on the taxes for the company. He was the president of this insurance company, and the guy wanted him to cheat on the taxes, and Schaeff wouldn't do that. And I'm not so sure it was because Schaeff was such an honest person, but I think it was because Schaeff thought that if they got caught, he would be the scapegoat. And he kind of knew that this guy wasn't a stand-up guy, and he'd probably blame it on my dad, and so my dad would go to jail or whatever. So anyway, he got fired. And the guy said, "You'll never work in this town again," or whatever. So like my dad was unemployed. He was the president of a life insurance company, and he was unemployed for like 6 months.
Yeah, that was the one thing about Bob, was he was like honest to a fault. I mean, he just refused to do anything dishonest, or, he was like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. If there was a problem with anything, he took responsibility for it. And there was a guy in the insurance company that he worked for in Southern California, Dr. Gumbiner. If you're going to insure stuff, you have to have a certain amount of capital inside a bank or something to be able to insure that much. And there's a certain ratio that you have to have. And he wanted Dad to cook the books to be able to say that he could do twice as much insurance as he actually could with the money he had on hand. And Bob said, there's no way I'm doing that. And he said, well, you're either doing it or you're not going to do it at all. And Dad said, I'm not going to do it at all. And so he kind of got a reputation as being a real straight shooter. And while the company in Dodge City didn't mind that so much, after he was there for a while and got the reputation in the Midwest as that, he got a job with Kansas City Life, which was a pretty big life insurance company in Kansas City, and they did it basically because they knew his reputation. And he had a good enough reputation that once they put him in charge, knew that he would do it right when any company had a problem. So.
Like my dad was unemployed. He was the president of a life insurance company, and he was unemployed for like 6 months. They were running out of money, and he had 3 young kids that he had to support. So, he was from Iowa. He was from the Midwest. He knew that, right? They had lived in California for at least 10 years. Big city. They lived in Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And after 6 months of work, he took a job in Cimarron, Kansas. And I don't know what the population of Cimarron was at that point, but it was so small that he wouldn't live there. He bought a house 20 miles east of Cimarron in Dodge City, Kansas, which the population of Dodge City at that time was, 10,000 people maybe? So yeah, he went from Los Angeles to Dodge City. He was the president of a life insurance company, and he was right back at it and working. And he was only there for like 5 years. After that, he kind of made a name for himself or whatever, and then he got a job in Kansas City. We got out of Dodge City, which was a real small town, away from, it was in the middle, like literally nowhere, right? The nearest big city was Wichita, Kansas, and that was 3 hours away. There was nothing. It was western Kansas cattle.
So we had 3 children, and Bob took a job in Dodge City, Kansas, running an insurance agency. And we were there for quite some time. Our children were in junior high when we moved into Kansas City. And that's where we've stayed since then.
And then after Southern California, we moved to Dodge City, Kansas. And Bob changed jobs, but he worked for a completely different company that was selling life insurance. It was Crop Hail Company. So in Kansas, they insure the wheat and corn that if there's a hailstorm, the farmer isn't wiped out. He gets hail insurance, and if he gets all his crops lost, he gets insurance for it. So that was the company that he worked for in western Kansas.
We went from Palos Verdes in Southern California to Dodge City. Culture shock. You go from large city, beach, warm weather to tumbleweeds, snowdrifts that are 8 foot high, and just a different personality. I loved it, but it was very different from what we were used to in California. Just everything. We thought at least I thought I was going to be riding horses to school. Didn't know much more about Dodge other than that, other than Gunsmoke. I like Dodge. I am very glad we moved from Dodge because a lot of the people there haven't done much more since school. So, but yeah, I like Dodge overall. Dad worked in Cimarron, and he came out and helped. Both Scott and I swam on their swim team, and so he would come out and do the times and stuff and help with that. But all in all, Dodge was good. I liked it. We lived in 2 houses there. Scott was going, he didn't do senior year here, he did senior year in Dodge, so he was going into JUCO, I think, and then the Navy. So I was in 9th, and that made the Cork would have been in 7th.
He was a weird hippie kid from California, absolutely, and he had long blonde hair, so yeah, it was rough.
Dodge City, for a kid that was born and raised in California, was quite a culture shock. It was almost like, people joke about it, but it was almost like going back 20 years in the past, stepping back 20 years in the past. It was very much in the late 70s. It was still cruising the Strip and doing all those things that you saw in American Graffiti from the 50s. It was hanging out, and there really wasn't a whole lot to do in Dodge City besides drive around in your car. So it was a very big culture shock for at least me, but I was older.
I don't remember much of his older stories. I remember he had an old car in the garage, the Model A car. I remember that. They used to, I don't know what he did with it.
Part of his nostalgia thing was not only the Confederate Air Force, but he built and we tore them down, cleaned them up, worked on them, and fixed Model A's. We had 2 at one time, which didn't make Grandma all that happy to have both slots in the garage filled with Model A cars. But he had a good one and a beater one. And the amazing thing is those cars are so easy to work on. I mean, they were basically almost a tinker toy. They were so simple. And if you look at a V8 today, those V4s that they had only had maybe 50 moving parts in them. So it was pretty easy to work on them. And we would get together and build the engine together and rebuild the engine and work on the inside. And he always liked to convert the ones that had a trunk into a rumble seat, because he preferred the Model A's to have rumble seats instead of trunks, because you're not going any place that you need a trunk in the thing anyway, and you wanted to be able to put 4 people in it. Anytime somebody had a parade, he was always on the list to have at least somebody sitting in the back of it waving to the crowd and all those things. And he was pretty lenient on a few times. I would, me and friends would dress up as gangsters in the 20s. And with the girls would dress up like flappers, and we'd have the cap guns and stuff, and we'd drive around. We drove around in down on the plaza one time with one of the Model A's, and we had guys hanging on the sides of the Model A's with cap guns and stuff, and we were shooting people as we were going by until the cops finally stopped us and said, "You've got to stop doing that. A, you need to get back inside your car, and B, you need to stop shooting people with cap guns." So that was always a fun thing for him. But I mean, I think later in his life he got very nostalgic, so that was why we were working on old planes and working on old cars and those kinds of things.
The guy didn't retire for forever. He worked at Kansas City Life Insurance. They created a subsidiary, Armor Life, and he was the president. He was made the president when they created it, so he was the founding president of Armor Life. And so they moved here in 1980. I don't know, it was cute. He and my mom did cute like neighborhood things. They had a bridge group and a dinner group, and like I guess that was what people did in the 80s, but it's just kind of cool thinking about it because we don't do that now. My mom was really happy to move to Kansas City, to be out of, like Dodge City. And I didn't know it at the time, but I'm sure the rest of us, the kids, were better off to be in a bigger city with more opportunities.
Yeah, he worked downtown. He worked at Arm & Life from the time we moved up. In fact, he was up here before we could sell the house and move up. And so he worked at Arm & Life and did that until 1980, maybe 5 or 6. So it was right after I graduated from high school and then I started college. And he was down in Texas and I was going to DeVry up here. Instead of, I could have gone there too. And I didn't. And I umpired with Dad for years, and so that's something we had in common. We did a lot of that together. Women's softball, in fact, men's softball, fast pitch, slow pitch. Dad did umpiring for 40-some years before he got a foul ball in the back of his leg and gave him a blood clot. So he had to stop umpiring at that point. But yeah, we umpired. He umpired in Dodge. He umpired up here in Kansas City for years upon years, helped run the organization that taught us or went through the rules and set all that kind of stuff up for years.
One of his big things was umpiring. It was all part of that. He was like really, really honest, and he really wanted to see the scales balanced. So I think umpiring filled that need in him to say, this is safe, this is out, that was a fly ball, this was foul, this was fair. I think him having that in his world was something that he really appreciated and kind of got a big kick out of. And I had a very hard time going and watching him because he was the umpire, and A, you can't root for the umpire, and B, 50% of the time, somebody's not going to, 100% of the time, 50% of the people are not going to be happy with the call you make. And so it was very difficult for me to go to a game that he was umpiring because somebody was always yelling at him. And the crazy thing was, he didn't have a problem with it at all. He would, after the games, he would go up to both teams and, one would be yelling at him and he'd just talk the same to them. And the other team would be like, thanks, we won, great job. And he'd talk to them the exact same. He was just there to tell you this was either in or out. And that was all he was doing.
He loved to donate blood. He got up to over 100 gallons, which is crazy. He worked on their board. Grandpa donated blood a lot because he got in a car wreck, or not a car wreck, a motorcycle wreck when he was younger, and they had to give a lot of blood. And then also, I got in a bad car wreck in high school, and I had to have a lot of blood because of it, and Grandpa just always wanted us to give him blood because people always need it.
When we would go to the VA, when he started to get sick, I remember going with my mom all the time to the VA with him and just taking care of him. And like his brain thing that he had.
I don't mind. Unfortunately, he was misdiagnosed by the hospital. So the hospital, thinking that, he was at 88, he was at the end of his life, when in reality, he had a good 10, 12 years left because he was a Phillips, and that bloodline doesn't die. I mean, you'd drive a stake in their heart. My grandfather was 92, and he willed himself to die when they took his car keys away. So at 91, they took his car keys away and he was just done. And my grandmother, Myrtle, died at 99. So, their body just keeps working. So I think they thought that he was in worse shape than he was, and they diagnosed him with Alzheimer's. When in reality, he had water on the brain. And once they re-diagnosed him and figured it out like a year later, and put a stent in his head to relieve the pressure. But I think having that much pressure on his brain for like a year actually gave him a little bit of brain damage. So I think he was not quite as there as he should have been at the end of his life. He covered it well, but he had some mental issues that he was diminished capacity. But his body, you know, he did take 8 pills a day, but his body just kept chugging along. Yeah, he was not interested in things anymore. So he wasn't interested in being active and stuff.
Okay, so I do want to be a nurse, and I kind of reflected when I started doing my nursing stuff, when I do my clinicals and stuff with my elderly patients. They remind me a lot of Grandpa when I went to the hospital with him and the nursing home with him. And I could see like the treatment that they get, they don't really understand and they forget. And I remember my mom like writing things down, having to repeat it and constantly reminding him of it. And it kind of like lets me better connect with the patients. And if I could go back, I wish that I was older and I was going through nursing school when Grandpa was in the hospital, because in nursing homes, because I think that I could have like monitored it more. And I think it would have been interesting to be able to be a part of his care, because now it's all like connecting and I know why he was losing his memory and deteriorating the way that he was when he got older. So like I want to be better to my patients because I know that that's how Grandpa was.